Want to make a podcast? Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere and even earn money. All in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer, so no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify. And when you want to take conversations with your fans to the next level, Q&A and polls are the best way to get them talking. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, it's totally free with no catch. U.S. Navy history arriving. Welcome to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale, and the XO is not able to be here with us. He's busy getting flogged underneath the keel. So instead, I am joined with lawyer and foreign policy expert Sean Mirski, and he is here to talk to us about his new book, We May Dominate the World: Ambition, Anxiety, and the Rise of the American Colossus. So welcome, Sean. It's nice to have you.
Thank you for having me aboard.
So you are here to talk about your new book. So why won't we just jump into it? So from what I noticed when I went through it, it had a theme of the Monroe Doctrine. There we go. So can you provide a overview of the Monroe Doctrine and its significance? Because, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people like me have never heard of the dang thing.
Yeah, well, it's one of those terms that I think is, more commonly found on AP, US history tests than it is in sort of modern parlance. But it ends up being actually quite important to the history of the United States. And the story actually, I think, begins with the founding of the country. Um, and one of the things that I think Americans fail to appreciate, given just how powerful we are today, is that when this country was founded, it really was in an incredibly precarious position. There were 13 colonies, they're hanging to the edge of the eastern seaboard. And wherever else you looked across the continent, it was, great powers from Europe, all of which had relatively hostile intentions towards the United States and who would have, in a lot of ways, been happy to wipe it off the map at the first opportunity. Um, and so the first, few decades of the country's existence, the American leaders tried to follow George Washington's famous advice in his farewell speech of essentially, taking a sort of isolationist tact and basically avoiding getting embroiled into any conflicts with the great powers. This ended up being very difficult. And so we ended up first in a quasi war with France and then a real war with Great Britain in 1812. Um, and so it just sort of underscored, I think, the dangers of the position that we were in. But all this starts to change during the 1810s and especially the early 1820s, when all of the, not all of the other, but most of the other colonies in the hemisphere end up throwing off Spanish and Portuguese, the colonial masters. And so all of a sudden, the rest of the hemisphere, or at least large chunks of it, earn their independence. And you have essentially Latin American states, ranging from everything from Chile and Argentina all the way up to Mexico, right? And so for the United States, this is a game changer because for the first time, it really means that we're no longer in immediate danger of being invaded by our neighbors. And in fact, those neighbors are much weaker than we are. And so the risk, however, is that Europe is basically going to take advantage of those Latin American states' weakness and come back into the hemisphere and essentially recolonize those colonies. And this all culminates in this moment in 1823, where it looks as if there's this alliance of monarchies in Europe, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, that have formed something called the Holy Alliance, and it's dedicated to banishing, secularism and stomping out democracy and republicanism, And there's this real fear among American leaders that it's about to descend on the hemisphere and help Spain and Portugal reconquer all their lost colonies. And the United States just cannot let that happen. And so President Monroe, in his State of the Union message, basically goes to Congress and says, listen, we are declaring that as Americans, we're not going to cross the ocean. We're not going to interfere with Europe's business or anything like that. We're not going to interfere with any colonies that Europe may have left in the hemisphere. But we want to make it very, very clear that we will not tolerate Europe coming back in and trying to recolonize any parts of the hemisphere or to essentially take over any of these countries, by extending political influence from Europe. And so that's when the Monroe Doctrine's born. And it really, for the next 150 years, it is the North Star of American grand strategy. I think until you get to the Cold War, it is literally the most important thing going on in American foreign policy. Essentially, it's the containment strategy of its day.
So to dumb it down for, people like me, it's you stay in your hemisphere and we'll stay in ours. And that's just an
Exactly.
announcement to the world.
Exactly. It's this giant, keep out sign in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Um, And, for the first few decades, the US basically had just no capability to enforce it. By the time from 1823 to roughly, the Civil War, the US, I mean, Navy is not much to speak of and certainly can't really go up against kind of European forces. Um, and frankly, the US is just much more interested from a security perspective in filling out the rest of the continent. So expanding to the West, settling, the Louisiana Purchase, and then there's the Mexican American War. And so there's a lot of stuff going on sort of, I don't want to say domestically because technically at this point, parts of the continent weren't yet part of the United States, but it's all sort of continental focused. And so it doesn't really have the chance to do much about these European incursions that are happening elsewhere in the hemisphere. But that all basically starts to change with the Civil War. And that's essentially where my book starts.
So how would you say that this shaped US foreign policy?
Well, so uh, in a lot of ways, the Monroe Doctrine was sort of it was a response to what Americans saw as the greatest national security threat. As I mentioned before, all of the independent states of the Western Hemisphere weren't a real threat to the United States in any sort of material way. There was never really a risk that Mexico was going to invade and, conquer the United States. And there's certainly no risk that Guatemala or, Argentina or anything like any other country is going to do that. And so from the American perspective, the only real threat, the only real powers that have the ability to kind of harm it are the European great powers. And, you saw that in the War of 1812, where the British burned down, much of Washington, D.C. And you'll see it again kind of recurring at other points in American history where these powers in Europe have these massive military establishments. They have these massive navies and they have these massive armies. And there's this real concern that it's those powers that are basically going to come in and hurt the United States. But the thing that American policymakers realize is that a direct threat or a direct attack or invasion on the United States is relatively unlikely for a variety of reasons. And so instead, the concern that Americans have is that Europe is going to come in indirectly through the Americans' neighbors. And so, as I mentioned before, there's this threat in 1823, or at least this perceived threat of Europe recolonizing the Latin American states. And in one form or another, that's basically the same concern that Americans have for the next 150 years, that some power in Europe is going to come in and it's going to either explicitly colonize a Latin American country or kind of take over implicitly in a way that eventually leads to European military forces in being concentrated in really high numbers in the Western Hemisphere, which in turn will directly affect American security. And so that's sort of the lens through which Americans are thinking about this problem. And you see this sort of, I think there's a bit of a debate inside the United States of how real this problem is, but that debate ends up being settled during the Civil War because, most Americans, I think, were obviously taught about, the battlefields of Antietam and Gettysburg and all that. But I think sometimes there's not as much attention paid to what was happening outside the United States, the sort of foreign policy of the Civil War. And one of the really remarkable things is that the European great powers saw the United States tearing itself apart and basically said, excellent, this is our opportunity. We have been concerned about this rising power across the ocean. Now is our chance to sort of really, kind of correct the balance of power in our favor. And so kind of most I think that the most direct affront is France, which invades and occupies all of Mexico during the Civil War. And the timing is not a coincidence. The French Emperor Napoleon III, talks to his advisors, and he's like, basically, I've been wanting to do this for a while, but now that the North and the South are at each other's throats, like this is the time to go in. And so France occupies all of Mexico, Spain recolonizes the Dominican Republic, and all of this is sort of seen as just like the entry point, right? I mean, France has this idea that once it's pacified Mexico, it's going to kind of extend its monarchical system all the way down south through the rest of Latin America. And Americans understandably go ballistic when they learn about, when they hear about this and they learn about this. And I think one of the remarkable things I realized in the course of my research is that even in the middle of the Civil War, you're talking, 1863, 1864, in both the South and the North, there's like these huge domestic constituencies that are basically saying, forget the Civil War. Let's just put a pause on this and like take care of France, because that is in so many ways a bigger problem than like what we're actually arguing about. Um, Now, it doesn't obviously happen that way, but there is this, sense that this is a massive threat. And, once the Civil War concludes, in 1865, the North immediately rushes 50,000 troops down to the border with Mexico, and basically is like ready to invade Mexico to kick the French out and go to war with France. Um, which again is just this like remarkable moment, right? I mean, you've just finished the most bloody and kind of exhausting war that the United States has ever fought, and 3 months later, you're ready to go to war with, at that point, what is the greatest power in the world. And I think it just speaks to the depth of feeling that the United States and American both American leaders and the American public had about keeping Europe out of the hemisphere.
So, in to keep with the theme of this podcast, what ways did the U.S. Navy play in implementing and upholding the principles of the Monroe Doctrine and keep this hemispheres separate?
Yeah, so I think it ended up playing an important role in, I guess, two ways. The most important one was as sort of the ultimate backstop in case Europe did decide to cross the ocean. And so um, you see this in a couple different kind of crises that characterize the next few decades. I mean, I guess it's worth saying that after the Civil War, for a variety of reasons, it looked like the threat from Europe was receding. And, uh, you know, due to kind of budget constraints and other concerns domestically, the US basically lets the Navy just fall to pieces, right? And so by the early 1880s, the U.S. Navy is an international joke. Oscar Wilde, in one of his books, has one of his protagonists talking to a ghost and saying, uh, well, you wouldn't want to come to the United States. We don't have any ruins or any curiosities. And the ghost responds, no ruins, no curiosities. You have your Navy and your manners. And it's just this like, literally an international punchline. Um, but starting in the kind of 1870s and picking up steam over the next couple of decades, Europe starts embarking on what's called the Second Age of Imperialism. And this is basically just this massive colonial effort that rivals even the First Age, which was, the age of Columbus and all that. And, from 1870 to 1910, Great Britain, France, and Germany, they end up colonizing over 9 million square miles, which is roughly twice the size of Europe itself. And so if you've heard of the scramble for Africa, if you've heard of, China, kind of the Opium Wars and the Century of Humiliation, all of that is happening at this time. Europe, Asia, and the Middle East are just getting carved apart by the European powers. And so for the United States, there's this like massive concern, as I mentioned before, that the Western Hemisphere is going to be next. And the Navy ends up being seen as the sort of the ultimate backstop against that happening. And so starting in the early 1880s, you have this naval buildup that basically continues more or less unabated for the next 40 years through the end of World War I. As the US continues to modernize in an effort to keep Europe at bay. And so, for instance, there's this crisis in 1902 and 1903 where Germany and Great Britain launched this intervention against Venezuela. And Theodore Roosevelt basically concentrates every single major warship in the Navy in the Caribbean as basically a warning that if anything goes awry, the United States is prepared to act. And so the Navy serves that role first and foremost. But the Navy also serves a sort of interesting secondary role, which I don't think anyone had sort of intended for it to serve initially. And that's the role of sort of bullying the United States' neighbors. One of the kind of things I tried to explain in this book is why is it as the United States rose that it ended up being so aggressive and expansionist towards its neighbors? And this is not like, an exaggeration. From like 1898 to the end of World War One, we were invading or using force against one of our neighbors an average of almost twice a year. And so it's just a streak of interventionism with really little precedent, kind of in any other point in American history, or at least nothing quite rivals it. And the Navy obviously is the edge of or the tip of the spear for that, given that most of our interventions are happening in the Caribbean or Central America, and it's not a role that the U.S. Navy I think was built to serve. I mean, most of the buildup at this point is focused on battleships, dreadnought class vessels, that sort of thing. Um, but the problem that the United States kind of ends up facing is that it's really worried about Europe coming into the hemisphere. But a lot of its neighbors are incredibly weak and incredibly unstable. And they're, just completely wrecked by civil war, by revolution. Their finances are a mess. And so they present this really tempting opportunity for European expansion. And so the US basically decides that what it needs to do to preserve its own security is to stabilize its neighbor. And the way it decides to do that is first, kind of through an indirect way, through trade and diplomacy and all that. But over time, it gets drawn into kind of using more and more aggressive and invasive methods of stabilization. And so ultimately, as I mentioned, there's this like 2 decade streak of just straight up, invading and occupying a lot of these places, essentially as an effort, first and foremost, just to keep Europe out. And so it's a little bit of, a situation where, to prevent Europe from expanding into the Caribbean, the United States decides it has to expand into the Caribbean first. Um, and the Navy, as I said, kind of ends up playing a pretty critical role in that sort of gunboat diplomacy.
Yeah, when I was going through the those sections, which is quite a much big chunk of the book, it seemed like that. Yeah, they tried first to bump up the economies to try to get them to be stable. Then when they found out that wasn't happening, they were like, well, maybe it's because of the leadership. So let's start changing out their leaders. A lot of that, and also saying, well, fine, then we'll just run your economy.
Yeah. Well, and this is, this all, I think Americans went into this with a sort of remarkable naivete, that I think was born of a lot of different things. But, their view initially was that, and kind of throughout was that, well, the reason these governments are so unstable is because of this one, whatever it is, this one easy problem. And if we just fix this, then everything will be fine. Right. And so, Theodore Roosevelt has this, famous speech where he talks about the United States acting as an international policeman. And, I think his idea is basically that the US is just going to, swing its little bat around and occasionally, smack a country on the head if it's misbehaving. And that's going to be good enough to sort of keep everyone, you know, in check and behaving well. The problem is that, that just doesn't work. And the US gets drawn more and more in. And it turns out you don't have to just be a policeman. You also have to be a sanitation worker. You also have to be, a judge. You have to be a health worker. And there's just like, an economist. I mean, and so the US ends up eventually just like getting drawn into these sometimes decade long occupations because it just can't figure out any other way in which to stabilize its neighbors.
Was there any thought of just, bringing them into the fold permanently?
Yeah, so it's a great question because especially if you look up to at the history of the country up through like 1900, annexation was kind of our thing, right? I mean, the US went from being these 13 colonies on the edge of the seaboard to like taking over an entire continent. Um, but for various reasons, that basically ends in, 1899 with one important exception. And there's a lot of different reasons for it, but most of them relate to kind of the aftermath of the Spanish American War. And so in the Spanish American War, we have this resounding victory over Spain. And at the end of the war, for reasons we can discuss, we end up annexing the Philippines and Puerto Rico, along with Guam, a few other minor islands, um, and then kind of installing a protectorate over Cuba. And the Philippines, the annexation of the Philippines ends up being a disaster. At the time, it had a good amount of support, but that support quickly vanishes for a variety of reasons. But one of the most important is that the Filipinos just launched this insurgency that the US eventually wins, but it's an incredibly dirty war. A lot of the US soldiers are incredibly racist. They're doing extremely awful things. I mean, this is where like the early precursor to waterboarding gets introduced and used quite frequently. There's torture, extrajudicial killing. I mean, it's an absolute mess, right? And so even the US kind of, wins that war. It's just such a draining experience for the army, but also for the country as a whole, that there's this like deep sense that the US shouldn't be doing this again. Um, the other half of the picture, though, and one of the most important reasons that annexation just doesn't end up getting used is frankly American racism. And I think a lot of people sort of had the misconception that the United States, in part, was bullying its neighbors a lot because it had this sort of like white man's burden kind of understanding of its obligations. But the truth is almost exactly the opposite, which is that for self-proclaimed anti-imperialists, racism was probably the most powerful argument in their quiver, right? Every time there was this argument of like, well, we should annex the Philippines, we should annex Cuba, we should annex any of these islands. The anti-imperialists would immediately say, "Are you kidding me? Do you really want to bring all these non-white people into the body politic?" And for Americans of the day in both the North and South, that was an incredibly important argument. And so it didn't always work. Hawaii still got annexed, the Philippines still got annexed. But in places like Cuba and the Dominican Republic, where there at various points in American history was this really powerful annexationist impulse, that racism was probably the most important factor that prevented those places from getting swallowed up permanently.
So I'm just wondering, you know, when we finally did pull out of all those countries, because we realized, hey, we're actually just screwing things up even more. We just need to
Hmm.
step back and let them decide what they want to do. How long were they in total disarray, if they ever even recovered? I mean, we've seen a modern example of that in Afghanistan.
Yeah, so it's hard to say. I mean, in a lot of places, um, I think generally speaking, well, I shouldn't say that. So in some places, our withdrawal was about as successful as our withdrawal from Afghanistan. To give you one example, we sent Marines into Nicaragua, basically starting in 1910. But we had a kind of significant garrison in the capital for, I think, permanently since 1912 to I think about 1925. And in the 1920s, you really see this kind of broader retrenchment. Americans are trying to get out of these wars and all this. And so in 1925, the State Department decides that it wants to bring the Marines home, and so they kind of evacuate the Nicaraguan capital. And this seems like a major success for all of like 3 weeks, because 3 weeks later, there's a coup, and immediately the country sort of descends into a new bout of civil war. And so the Marines end up having to come back again, and we end up occupying all of Nicaragua from like 1927 through early 1930s. And so there really is this kind of difficulty where, on the one hand, we don't want our neighbors to be unstable, but on the other hand, the second we pull out, they seem to become even more unstable than before we left. Um, in other cases, though, what ends up happening is that when the US is there, and one large part of its stabilization project in many of these occupations is to build up what's called a constabulary, which is sort of like a quasi police, quasi military force. The idea is that these forces are going to protect the lawfully elected government and act in a sort of outside of politics, totally neutral way. With the benefit of hindsight, of course, we can say that that just didn't pan out at all. And so what ends up happening is that in a lot of these countries, the US creates this incredibly powerful, well organized armed force, and it stamps out sort of competing centers of power. And then when the US leaves, it leaves, governments that are elected, that nominally represent the will of the people, but that are just no match for these armed forces that the, US has kind of grown up in its midst. And so, in particular, in sort of the late 1920s, like through the 1930s, when the US is kind of withdrawing from a lot of these countries, what you end up seeing is the rise of these kind of dictators, many of whom end up controlling their countries, for decades on end. And so in Nicaragua, for instance, as I mentioned, we finally ended up withdrawing, I believe, in 1932, 1933. Um, I guess it would be 1933. And there is a lawfully elected government, and it lasts a few years, but eventually the head of the National Guard ends up taking over, Somoza, and he, basically runs the country along with the rest of his family until, he's overthrown in the 1970s. And so that ends up being, kind of one of many tragic consequences of our involvement in a lot of these countries' internal affairs.
So let's go to the other side of the pond. How are the other European powers taking all of this?
So I would say they took it with a sort of mixed perspective. On the one hand, the United States essentially was approaching the European powers and offering them a deal, which was, if you stay out of the hemisphere, we'll keep order on your behalf. So, a lot of these European interventions were launched because Europe wanted to, let's say, collect on a debt, or wanted to, keep its citizens safe. And, the local government wasn't doing a good job. And so the idea was that by acting as the policeman of the Western Hemisphere, the United States would essentially serve those functions, keep European property, keep European lives safe, and as a result, Europe wouldn't have a good reason to intervene. And so that was the bargain in a sense. And from Europe's perspective, that was a pretty good bargain, right? It didn't necessarily have uh, taking over the Western Hemisphere was not a high priority for any European nation, or at least it was a far lower priority than kind of other things. And so having the US sort of protect, your citizens' lives, your citizens' property seemed like a pretty good idea. On the other hand, though, there is this sort of expansion of European of American influence, and in a way that ends up squeezing out European interests. And so you see this in the Taft administration in particular. There's this policy called dollar diplomacy, where one of the kind of important aspects of that policy is that the United States government helps a lot of these countries refinance these like massive loans that they have to European creditors, helps refinance them through American banks. And the idea is essentially you want to start eliminating and squeezing Europe's stake out of the hemisphere, because if Europe doesn't have an economic stake, doesn't have a political stake, then it doesn't have any reason to sort of intervene, and therefore, American security is better protected. Um, and Europe, frankly, is obviously less than happy about this in a lot of ways. But given the sort of timing, and with, all the tensions on the continent, and the kind of, World War One being just around the corner, there's not a lot that the Europe can do. And so over time, what you sort of see is this kind of gradual diminishment of Europe's interests. And then once World War One happens, I mean, that just accelerates in a major way, right? Because for one thing, like German U-boats are cutting basically all of the Allies' links with the hemisphere. And, the Allies in turn are busy sort of directing all of their resources against Germany rather than, trying to trade with Latin America. And so during World War One, like the US proportion of trade and things like that with the hemisphere just goes through the roof. And by the end of the war, it's just absolutely clear that Europe has no chance of really making a comeback in the hemisphere at all, at least for the foreseeable future.
The dollar diplomacy reminds me that when these countries did default on their loans, which, happened quite often, that
Quite a
they
bit.
would actually send their military in to collect that debt.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the misconceptions you sometimes hear about US foreign policy is that we did the same thing. And that's, I think, just not true. The US very early on made it clear that, if you're a business and your investment goes south, or you lose, or some Latin American country owes you money, we're not going to use our military forces to enforce that in the same way that the Europeans will. Um, but at the same time, I think the confusion is a little bit understandable, because we did end up sort of trying to create this order where Latin American countries were living up to their obligations, not because we cared in the first instance whether, an American creditor or European creditor got its money, but because we just didn't want to give European powers in particular the pretext to intervene. Um, but yeah, I mean, it was a wild time in terms of what international law allowed, or at least what the great powers said it allowed. Um, and so you actually see the United States calling these conferences in Europe, and sort of participating in them actively, trying to change international law precisely so it forbids this sort of thing. Um, because again, the U.S. is sort of interested in removing any pretext for European intervention in the hemisphere.
So you brought us to World War One now. So How did the Monroe Policy adapt or change to post World War One?
Yeah. So the entire idea of the Monroe Doctrine, I mean, so President Monroe had promised that the U.S. wasn't going to interfere with existing European colonies. Um, and in a sense, I think he was crossing his fingers behind his back. I mean, it was true certainly that the US didn't have the capacity to do that at the time he made his announcement. But the sort of implicit idea behind the Monroe Doctrine was, the United States is the most powerful state in the Western Hemisphere, at least compared to all the other independent states. The only real threat are these European outposts. And so, for the US to be secure, we need to become what political scientists like to call a regional hegemon, which is essentially a situation where the only great power in a particular geographic area is that there is only one great power. And so in this case, that would be the United States. And by the end of World War One, the US has achieved that objective, right? I mean, there's just no realistic prospect that any power anywhere else in the world can put up a serious fight against the United States in the Western Hemisphere. And in a lot of ways, that sort of means that the Monroe Doctrine has, accomplished its goal. And so, what you see over the next decade and a half is essentially this sort of, as I mentioned, this withdrawal of American influence. The U.S., basically starts pulling back from all these countries. Stops worrying about European intervention. Stops worrying about whether these countries are stable or not, because even if they're unstable, it just doesn't matter anymore. There's not much that Europe can do about it that really presents a threat. Um, this isn't, obviously a permanent state of their affairs because in the mid 1930s, um, Americans start becoming worried about the rise of a new great power in Europe, and that's of course Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan to a lesser extent. And so in the late 1930s, you sort of have this reversal of the trend where FDR just starts becoming incredibly concerned about the risk that Hitler's going to, take over all of Europe and then use Africa as a jumping off point to attack South America and then work, his way up the Western Hemisphere towards the United States. Um, and we look at World War II kind of through, I think, a European centric lens, in part because after World War II, American foreign policy becomes really oriented at Europe and the Cold War with the Soviet Union and all that. But if, the actual like thinking and the sort of calculations that FDR and his cabinet were making were all in terms of the Western Hemisphere right up until entry into World War II. There was just this incredible concern of like, how do we maintain the Monroe Doctrine in light of the Nazi threat? And you have FDR kind of in these internal cabinet meetings telling, them like, we have to go whole hog on the Monroe Doctrine, right? We have to protect the hemisphere against the Nazi threat. Um, and so, that's sort of the dynamic that develops until FDR eventually just recognizes that if we're really worried about Nazi Germany coming into the hemisphere, our options are either wait until they get here. And for various reasons, FDR thinks that's just not going to be a good idea, or we can go to Europe now and help Great Britain and the Soviet Union basically beat Nazi Germany in Europe, and that for a variety of reasons is going to be a safer bet for us. And that's obviously the what ends up happening. And then it's only in the aftermath of World War II that the U.S. really starts to focus on Europe as sort of the primary region for its security.
Right. So they didn't necessarily want to jump into the fight because we still liked our separatist attitude,
Hmm.
but they also did not want to bring it. So that's when the whole Lend Lease and everything like that started, shipping supplies, pulled us out of the Great Depression.
Yep.
And we actually ended up being the only country to actually profit off of the war.
By quite a bit, actually. And again, I mean, one of the points I make in the book is that you can't really understand the rise of the United States as the global superpower that it is today without understanding that all of that depends on it being a regional hegemon, right? Because in World War One, in World War Two, you see the same thing again and again, which is that the other great powers are just tearing themselves to shreds. They're burning, they're bleeding. All of this fighting is happening on their territory. And in both wars, the U.S. doesn't have to worry about that, right? I mean, the U.S. suffers tremendous casualties in both wars, but for the most part, it's on foreign soil, right? And I think that a large part of the reason that's the case is because the U.S. basically managed to carve out this sphere of influence, this area of the world where it was the only great power. It didn't have to worry about competition, and that allowed the hemisphere to sort of become a springboard from which it could start, intervening in the rest of the world for good or for bad, depending on your perspective.
So up until World War II, um, was any of the long-term implications of Monroe Doctrine being felt yet?
Yeah, well, um, so the Monroe Doctrine, I mean, in a lot of the argument I make towards the end of the book, so I sort of finish with the dawn of the Cold War. One of the points I make is that on one level, the Cold War sort of saw the Monroe Doctrine become obsolete because the whole idea of the Monroe Doctrine was, look, as long as we can keep the other great powers on the other side of the ocean, we're going to be safe. And the US achieves that at the end of World War II. But, we're entering an era of ICBMs and kind of nuclear submarines and sort of technology that just makes it incredibly easy to project force in a way that wasn't necessarily the case before. And so the Monroe Doctrine's kind of hemispheric focus feels, I think, very small minded to most Americans at that point. Um, and so the US, for that and for a variety of other reasons, ends up taking a bit of a more not a bit more, takes on a majorly kind of new global role at the end of World War II. Um, but part of the problem too is that, at the end of World War II, like all of Europe is essentially lying in ruins except for the Soviet Union. And so there's this real sense among Americans that if we don't go to, Western Europe's aid, if we don't do the Marshall Plan, if we don't do, station our forces there in NATO and kind of other alliances, we're gonna face a situation where the Soviet Union, the Red Army, just steamrolls across the continent, and then ends up becoming a regional hegemon in its own right. The only great power in all of Europe. And so the U.S. basically says we can't let that happen. And so the Cold War, in a lot of ways, I mean, the argument that I make is that it's essentially not that different from the Monroe Doctrine. It's just that instead of telling the other great powers that they can't cross the ocean, we're focused on one great power, the Soviet Union, and we're saying that, basically it can't cross the Iron Curtain. And so, same as during the Cold War, we contained the Soviet Union into kind of its sphere of the world. The Monroe Doctrine itself, in a lot of ways, was just us containing the old world, away from kind of the new world shores. And so I think there's a lot of continuity. I think there's a lot, the foreign policy of the United States really doesn't change that much other than kind of taking on this new, more global kind of frame. And of course, we never lose interest in our hemisphere itself. The Cuban Missile Crisis, I think, is a pretty good example of just how touchy the United States still is about great power sort of coming into its area. But of course, there's other examples too, ranging from funding an insurgency in Nicaragua, getting involved with like death squads across the continent. In a lot of ways, it's kind of a continuation of what came before. Um, and so, the Monroe Doctrine, I think, sort of lives on, even though the exact phrase stops being used kind of in the same way that it used to be.
So what have they replaced it with?
Well, containment, George Kennan containment and kind of this, the broader framework of sort of keeping Soviet influence, contained in a particular area. Um, but, I think it really, there's this moment in, I think, the 70s where Henry Kissinger is testifying, in Congress. And there's this young senator named Joe Biden who basically like is listening to Henry Kissinger describe the administration's containment strategy. And at some point, he just interrupts Dr. Kissinger and says, "You're just talking about a global Monroe Doctrine." And, Kissinger denies it for kind of obvious reasons. But I think that's basically exactly right. I mean, that's what the United States was basically doing at that point.
Right. Well, after World War II, when the only real threat in the entire world was the Soviet Union, so naturally that's where we would put our focus because we don't want to have them just take advantage of the war-torn Europe and just do finish what Hitler started.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and, I mentioned before that looking at the kind of sweep of American interventionism in Latin America, um, my point is that a lot of it, I think, was driven by the United States being concerned about these power vacuums developing in its neighbors that presented opportunities for European expansion. That same dynamic, I think, describes a large part of the Cold War. The US is basically worried about these power vacuums, developing first in Europe itself, but then in Africa, the Middle East, Asia. and worry that Soviet influence is basically going to kind of sweep into those power vacuums. And so what it ends up doing is, first, it tries to stabilize a lot of these countries kind of from the distance using trade and diplomacy and all the other things we were talking about before. But once again, that doesn't work that well in a lot of cases. And so in a lot of cases, the US ends up being drawn itself into that power vacuum. And so you see this kind of massive expansion of American influence. And so that's true whether it's, the Korean Peninsula, that's Vietnam, that's a lot of the, wars we were fighting in, proxy wars we were fighting in, Africa, Middle East, South Asia. Um, in a lot of ways, the U.S. is just still dealing with the same problem of how do you prevent a rival from expanding into kind of a war torn, unstable region unless you yourself are willing to expand into that region first.
So, what we're dealing with now, I guess, could be described as just trying to maintain the status quo to try to keep everybody right where they're at.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, and it's funny because throughout most of its history, the United States was what political scientists would call a revisionist power, in the sense that it wasn't happy with the status quo, right? It wanted to change things. It wanted to kick Europe out of the Western Hemisphere. It wanted to grow until it was so powerful, no other nation could change it or could challenge it. Of course, now that we've done that, the US has this massive interest in sort of keeping the status quo as it is. And instead, you have powers like Russia and China that have become the revisionist powers because they, of course, sort of don't love it that the US military kind of alliance and oftentimes US military forces are right up on their borders, presenting, a potential threat. Um, but there's a degree of sort of, I think, oftentimes irony, if not perhaps double standards in the way that the US oftentimes talks about this. And so, for instance, in Russia, and with respect to both Russia and China, the Biden administration kind of goes out of its way to say over and over again, this is the 21st century. We don't do spheres of influence. You know, we don't have any limits on the kind of alliances that people can form. If Ukraine wants to join NATO, that's Ukraine's decision, not Russia's. Blah 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 blah. At the very same time we're saying that, number one, it's a little bit inconsistent with what we were doing a century ago, which was, in fact, creating a sphere of influence and very much saying what our neighbors could and could not do vis-a-vis Europe. But it's still, even today, there's a little bit of a double standard. You might have seen in the news last week, for instance, that the Wall Street Journal broke this story about how China has agreed to give Cuba billions of dollars in exchange for setting up a signal intelligence facility to listen in on American communications in Cuba. And, the story's still developing, so we don't know exactly where this is going to go. But already the sort of reaction from much of the political class in the United States is like, are you crazy? Like, how on earth do you think you can do this, China? This is wildly inappropriate. And again, it's this sense that like, Cuba is part of our hemisphere. Like, you're not allowed to do this here, even though, of course, the United States has its own listing facilities in Asia right off China's borders. And so, um, you know, I, I think the double standard is in a sense defensible from the perspective of American interests. But obviously, sort of stepping back, separate from American interests, there is this, question of like, is the United States being totally consistent in kind of what it says and what it does?
Oh, it's not. We're projecting our own sphere of influence to try to tell people they can't do it. No. Sorry. I'm gonna say that right now. It's not.
Yeah, and again, I mean, that's not. I don't mean to be harsh on the United States because I think every power acts essentially in that way. That it's perfectly happy to be revisionist until it's on top, and then of course it wants to preserve the status quo. So we're not any different than any other power in that respect. But it does mean that sometimes our rhetoric, I think, to a lot of other nations can come across as being a little bit hypocritical.
So how do you think this is going to shape into the future with, our modified, I guess, Monroe document doctrine?
Yeah. So I guess there's two points that I think are worth making about the future. One is specifically about the Monroe Doctrine. What you've seen in the last decade or so is that China really is expanding its influence into the Western Hemisphere in a way that I think appropriately gives Americans cause for concern. Some of it is fairly innocuous. I mean, Latin America's trade with China has increased in a fairly significant way. I think that's essentially inevitable given just how much of an economic force China is. The more concerning part of the story is that China is oftentimes using economic leverage as sort of a way to get to achieve its political and strategic goals. And so you see, for instance, Chinese state-owned companies taking control of maritime infrastructure near strategic choke points like the Panama Canal, or like the southern tip of South America. You see, for instance, China setting up these space facilities in the region that kind of oftentimes have a dual, civilian military use purpose, and it has more in the Western Hemisphere than any other region of the world. And so there's this sense that China is, actively not only pursuing economic, but also political and military goals in the hemisphere. And I think this latest story with Cuba sort of just, doubles down on that point. And so my suspicion is that as that continues to increase, I think the Monroe Doctrine will probably come, I don't want to say it'll come back into vogue, but certainly there'll be more conversation about it. And I think it's that Americans are going to become increasingly sort of concerned about this happening. The challenge for the United States is how do you deal with that situation without um, creating a backlash among your neighbors, right? Because saying the phrase the Monroe Doctrine immediately gets Latin Americans, hair to stand on end for understandable reasons. I mean, from the United States, it's a mixed history at best. From the Latin American perspective, it's basically just a nonstop record of the U.S., invading, launching coups, and just this very dark history that the U.S. doesn't want to necessarily repeat. And so for the U.S., it's this kind of how do you convince Latin American countries not to let China, come into the hemisphere too much without at the same time feeling like you're threatening them in a way that could then lead them to go to China for protection. So I think that's one of the big challenges. The other point that I wanted to make is that I wrote this book in large part because of China specifically. There's this kind of truism in among historians that rising powers tend to be aggressive and expansionist, which means that whenever you have a rising power, you see them picking fights with other great powers. You see them intervening and otherwise meddling in the affairs of their neighbors. And in general, rising powers just really seem to try to dominate greater and greater slices of the world. Um, and that's been true throughout history. It was certainly true in the case of the United States, and I think it seems to be borne out in the way China is more and more acting in its own region. Um, and I wrote the book in large part because I thought it would be useful to look at the United States as a case study to kind of better understand what are the mechanisms that cause rising powers to act that way. And my conclusion means that there's a significant kind of cause for concern when it comes to China. Because the same dynamics that led the United States to be aggressive in its own neighborhood, I think could potentially lead China to do the same. Um, I think China, same as the United States, is very concerned about keeping foreign great power influence at bay. It does not want the United States to expand further in Asia. And to the contrary, it very much wants to cleanse Asia of American influence. Um, but at the same time, there are these parts of its neighborhood that are incredibly unstable that offer the opportunity for an expansion of American influence. And so the so that I think there's this risk that in a lot of different places, China may end up sort of responding to instability, responding to sort of failed or failing states by trying to kind of move into those power vacuums before the United States can. And I'll give you just like one concrete example to kind of show how close the parallel is in a lot of cases. So after the Spanish-American War, we had promised at the start of the war to give Cuba its independence. And we did technically, but before doing so, we imposed something called the Platt Amendment on Cuba, which is essentially this it was this part of the Cuban Constitution that basically tied Cuba's hands behind its back in a number of different ways in in an effort on our part to prevent Cuba from sort of falling within kind of the clutches of some, avaricious European power. And one of the most important part of the Platt Amendment was Article 3, which basically gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuba to, at any point where instability reached a certain kind of point, right? So if Cuba's descending into anarchy, the U.S. wanted the right to go in because it was afraid that, if it didn't have that right, some other European power would go in. Uh, the problem is that the Platt Amendment ended up becoming ended up destabilizing Cuba because it acted as this sort of Damocles that was hanging over Cubans' heads. That was a massive incentive for Cuban opposition parties to use anytime they wanted to wipe away the governing party. And so this ended up happening in like 1906, where the moderate party took basically rigged the 1905 elections in Cuba and sort of held on to power. And so the liberal opposition basically launched this rebellion against the moderates. And from the US perspective, it didn't make any sense. Like, don't they know that if they start a civil war, we're going to intervene and take over the country? But that's exactly what the liberals understood. They knew that the US would come in, but from their perspective, it was much better to have the US in charge than to have the moderates in charge, and so they were happy to do it. And so there was this very kind of perverse situation where the US had created this amendment in part to stabilize these countries, but it ended up being used against. Why is this relevant to China? Well, last year, the China signed an agreement, a secret security agreement with the Solomon Islands, in which it basically agreed that it would land military forces and intervene if there was ever a significant risk of sort of instability in the country. It's very, very similar to the Platt Amendment. The only difference is that the Platt Amendment was not conditioned on the um, request or consent of Cubans, whereas the Chinese security agreement seems to be. But looking at American history, that consent actually was never really the issue. So, like in 1906, for instance, when the liberals were rebelling, the moderate government was more than happy to have the United States come in because it thought that the United States would help kind of squash this rebellion. And so you can see it. You can easily imagine a situation where the current kind of government of the Solomon Islands wants to hold on to power. It rigs an election. It does whatever, and the opposition basically says, this is completely unlawful and like launches a revolution, launches a civil war. And the existing government basically says, well, we don't want that to happen. And so they call in China to bring its forces and to sort of squash this rebellion. And suddenly, you have either Chinese occupation or at least like this massive expansion of Chinese military influence in the islands. And so it's, again, none of these hypotheticals are necessarily likely to happen, but it is, at least for me, interesting to see how closely a lot of Chinese foreign policy today is echoing, both what the United States did a century ago, but also the mistakes it made, and to sort of know where that might kind of lead next.
So where do you think it is going to lead? Seeing how it's mirroring, what does the in your mind, what does the future hold?
So I would say that it's always dangerous to make predictions, but I do think in a lot of ways history repeats itself or at least rhymes. And based on that, I would say that I would expect China to act aggressively and expansionistly in its neighborhood, not only in places like Taiwan, where I think the threat is sort of real and understood, but also in other places where there's a risk of power vacuums developing in a way that China might feel obligated to kind of fill. And so that's going to be everything from, the Korean Peninsula, where potentially a collapse of North Korea would lead to Chinese military intervention, to the West and Afghanistan and kind of other parts of Central Asia, to, the Southeast and places like Burma, where again, there's a real risk of kind of both serious instability, but also kind of, American influence. And I think China's going to potentially be in a situation where it might feel like it needs to kind of employ military force in order to protect its interests. So I would say that I'm pretty pessimistic about kind of what China's behavior is likely to look like in the next couple of decades.
All right. Well, we are coming up to that time. So as we come to a close, is there anything you want to add? Anything you want to say?
Not that I can think of. I think, the book, We May Dominate the World, Ambition, Anxiety, and the Rise of the American Colossus. It's coming out at the end of the month, but you can pre-order it today. And I think, it deals with a lot of the ideas we've been discussing on this podcast, but it also, I think, just tells some, pretty interesting stories about kind of the interventions we launched and, the first times we ever tried to do regime change and things like that, with a lot of lessons for today. And so, I hope it gets your interest.
Oh, especially that battle over the Panama Canal. That was very interesting.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me, Sean. And go out and get his book, guys. I've read through it. It's great. I highly recommend it.
Thank
And
you so much, Dale. Thank you for having me aboard.
and with that, guys, we're going to wish you fair winds and following seas.
Take care.
Bye-bye. U.S. Naval History Podcast, departing